Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to what promises to be an interesting and, as Tom Banchoff said earlier today, an entertaining aspect of our program. Let me, before I proceed, however, say again our thanks at the Berkley Center for the generous contributions of the Henry Luce Foundation initiative on religion and international affairs, without whose generosity we wouldn't be here today. We're grateful to the Luce Foundation. Now, some of you, the more astute among you, and there are many astute among you I know, have noticed that there have been no Catholics on this podium today so far. It's Lent, it's a question of self-discipline and mortification, but that's about to end because we have on the podium today two, and actually three if you count me, Roman Catholics who are going to have something to say about our subject today, proselytism and religious freedom. One great Catholic intellectual named John Courtney Murray wrote what many consider the best Catholic interpretation of the American founding, a book called We Hold These Truths, Catholic Reflections on the American Proposition. Note that noun, singular, proposition. Among many wonderful things in that book, which I highly recommend to you, is a definition of religious freedom as creeds intelligibly in conflict. And he adds later, under a canopy of civil discourse. We're about to see such a definition of religious freedom in action, although creeds not necessarily in conflict with these two Roman Catholics, although I must say that one time another Catholic said to me, "Tom, you and I look out of different portholes of the bark of Peter." So Catholics sometimes disagree, and we may see a little of that as well, certainly intelligibly in conflict. Jerry Bradley for many years has been a professor of law at Notre Dame. He is one of the country's preeminent scholars and interpreters of the First Amendment. He's been writing on that for many years. He's also a scholar of John Courtney Murray. I dare say a student of Murray, although he has been critical of him as well. And I'm delighted that he's here to join us. Jose Casanova, a sociologist, professor of sociology, and a senior fellow here at the Berkley Center, has written in 1994, 16 years ago, is that right, Jose? 16 years ago, a modern classic, Public Religions in the Modern World. Note the adjective. Those of you who are here for the Chicago World Affairs Council rollout a week or so ago noted that a major bumper sticker of that report was that religions are public. Well, Jose Casanova was saying this a long time ago. He was one of the first to begin to debunk, in a sense, the secularization theory. So what we have here are two world-class intellectuals, and I might add, since they're both friends, two world-class souls, to talk about the question of proselytism and religious freedom. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Jerry Bradley to come to the podium and begin our festivities.
Well, thank you, Tom Farr. I'm pleased to be here with Jose and to be part of this symposium. I'm also very happy to hear that positive report on the state of my soul. It's not quite what my spiritual director told me last Friday, but I like Tom's view of me better. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Now, Tom did mention to me earlier what he said to you a few minutes ago, that this is a bit of an entertainment. But now in the security of private conversation, Tom was a little more explicit about what he would count as entertainment. He said it's supposed to be an entertaining debate, and he said that he would like it if I would yell at Jose at some opportune or strategic moment, but he would like it even better if I would remove my size 13 shoes, pound the podium first, and then turn menacingly towards Jose. I said I would think about all of that. And he also said that the alternative would be that I could be very, very funny, but that he would prefer that I be both. Now, there is a problem. I like Jose Casanova much too much to yell at him, much less to menace him, even when he's wrong, which he usually is. And I'm not very funny. So I'm going to read to you my prepared remarks instead. Proselytism is religious expression with a mind to change another's beliefs. Anti-proselytism laws prohibit that sort of behavior. But what sort of behavior are we actually talking about? Decent laws and sound moral reasoning exclude trying to change another's beliefs by force or fraud, or where the effort is incompatible with parents' rightful authority over their children. That sort of thing, though, is not at issue here. Tom Farr's question in his synopsis or summary of this symposium is about winning adherents by persuasion, not by trickery or duress or by Pied Pipering somebody's kids. Now, I think basic components of religious liberty are not at issue here either. Sound reasoning and good law protect, just to take the phrasing of one organic document, the 1966 International Covenant, sound laws, good laws protect religious worship, observance, practice, and teaching in private and public, alone or in community with others, and all of this is protected against state interference. Now, these activities constitute religious expression, if anything does. Any one of them could be engaged in, at least partly, for the purpose of converting other people, and commonly they are. For proselytizing rarely involves any sort of explicit ask or plea for a conversion. Now, I'm not sure about Islam, and I say that most honestly and without any false modesty. I just don't know enough to speak about Islam confidently. But it may well have parallels to the propositional character and universal extension of the basic Christian confession of faith. Christ died for everyone's sins, yours just the same as mine. And the greatest missionary this world has ever known did not proselytize by asking people to convert. St. Paul instead told people how things really are. Or, to paraphrase here, adapt a bit the prologue to Luke's gospel, St. Paul gave his audiences an orderly theological account of the things which have been accomplished among us, so that they may know the truth, and by knowing the truth, may come to believe. And today, who wants to be harassed by a huckstering evangelist asking for your money as well as your confession of faith? What could be more potent instead than appealing for converts by asking folks to listen to a tape recording of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, or by having someone read A Day in the Life of Mother Teresa, or even watching a video of the many Christians who flocked to Haiti earlier this year to help people. In any event, the Spirit blows where it wills. So it seems to me the distinguishing feature of proselytization is an aim which typically supervenes upon ordinary religious expression. It's an accompanying mental state, or maybe just the unintended effect of witnessing to the truth of one's own faith. Proselytizing is not a distinct and observable chunk of behavior. And so, anti-proselytizing laws are quixotic and notional, or they are certain to sweep up within their reach more elemental religious expression, teaching, preaching, and worship, which expression as such is eminently deserving of protection. Now, this, I think, is enough to establish that anti-proselytizing laws are unjust. They surely would be deemed invalid for these reasons, for its oversweep in American constitutional law. Now, no doubt some missionaries, perhaps many, are so aggressive that they need to be restrained by just laws against forcing conversion. But more often the problem with missionary activity, where there is a problem, is that the missionaries are annoyingly persistent and self-righteous. Now, these folks should be corrected and ignored. They should not be arrested. Now, I think many missionaries, probably most, are guilty at one time or another of the distinctive missionary's original sin, which is to present their own cultural instantiation of the faith, say Irish Catholicism or Midwestern evangelicalism, as part and parcel of the true faith. This original sin, for missionaries, naturally leads to unjustified criticism of local custom. and local folk traditions, which themselves are either morally innocuous or even good. Now, of course, anti-proselytizing laws are about much more than this. They're not notional. They're a corollary of anti-conversion strictures. Together, anti-conversion strictures and anti-proselytizing laws form a kind of coherent matrix. It is certainly much more than notional, especially where they are supplemented by laws against apostasy. Now, what justification is on offer for this matrix of laws? Proselytizing is often criticized under the more generic rubric of interfering or even attacking other religions, usually indigenous religions honeycombed with folk traditions. But again, what sorts of behavior does this larger criticism refer to? And what are the pertinent moral norms for judging the validity of laws forming the matrix? Well, let me take up this latter question first. Emory's John Whitty phrases a relevant question, or this question, in a certain way. And here's what Whitty asks. How does one craft a legal rule that respects Orthodox, Hindu, Jewish, or traditional groups that tie religious identity not to voluntary choice, but to birth, caste, blood and soil, language and ethnicity? The authors of an essay in Rosalind Hackett's recent collection book, Proselytism Revisited, assert that it seems logically impossible to interpret the principle of religious freedom in a way that is neutral between religions like Islam and Christianity and the traditions of Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains. Now, the authors seem to be scandalized by this impossibility of there being a neutral rule or ground. But why should we expect the principle of religious freedom to be neutral about the freedom to talk to others about what is true or what's not true? The principle of religious freedom protects, just for example, worship in groups. Many religions involve no worship at all and are relentlessly individualistic. Does the thought that religious liberty is therefore somehow unjustly partisan leap to your mind? I hope not. Religious liberty also protects belief. Religions which define themselves otherwise by ethnicity or place of birth, for example, are not thereby victims of bias. Now, the core claim circulating within and behind the sentence I read to you from the Hackett author's claim about neutrality, the core claim circulating in there, I think, is something like this. It is that religious freedom ought to be about religious identity, and that religious freedom should therefore somehow be neutral as to various modes by which people establish their identities. But I think this is not the law anywhere I know of, and I don't think there's much critical support, critical reason to adopt that position, not least because I think identity, in this context at least, is not a perspicuous term. Now, the matrix, the legal matrix, anti-apostasy laws, anti-conversion laws, anti-proselytization laws, is also sometimes justified by appeal to norms of fairness. The idea here is that evangelical religions, such as Islam and Christianity, which claim to be uniquely or unsurpassably true, have an unfair advantage in recruiting adherents compared to religions which do not have these features or characteristics, such as Buddhism and Hinduism. What are we to make of this claim of unfairness in the competition for adherents? Well, the appeal of truth is surely different than the appeal, such as it is, of the putatively more vulnerable religions mentioned, but it is scarcely apparent to me which sort of appeal is, all things considered, actually more appealing. It seems to me, rather, that the appeal least likely to win adherents is precisely that the body of teaching on offer is simply true. Most especially where, as is the case with Christianity, the truth claims of the religion include promises of hard times in this life for believers. But I propose to take a more careful look at the justifications that I've been able to find for the legal matrix that I'm referring to. We get glimpses sort of drive-by views of this deeper, more complex justification from Whitty. John Whitty asks in an article from Faith and International Affairs, 2007, how does the state balance one community's right to another person's or community's right to be left alone to its tradition? Again, how does the state balance one community's right to proselytize over against another person's or a community's right to be left alone to its traditions? Even the redoubtable Tom Farr frames the question in roughly this way. Again, he raises it a question. I don't know that Tom is affirming either part of the proposition, but Tom says the question is the right to win adherence by persuasion balanced against a right of communities to defend their respective traditions. So now I think an argument is really coming into focus. Now, in an essay in this recent Hackett collection, I'm going to take out from that essay, one of the essays, a three-sentence account, justification really, for the legal matrix. And I'm going to read it to you and then talk about it. So here we go. A justification for the matrix. Attempts to proselytize are experienced as violations of the integrity of a community. Since ancestral practices are considered to be the common inheritance that holds a community together, any denunciation of them as false religion and even idolatry is viewed as an attempt to destroy the social fabric. From this perspective, our authors continue to say, successful conversions to Christianity and Islam create tears in the social fabric. Religious conversions disintegrate communities and families by drawing individuals away from these ancestral traditions. Our authors conclude that a stance of non-interference is central to these traditions. Now here we have ample reason to proceed with caution, for we can see in this mix of reasons, or this rich but compact account, reference to problems of social solidarity, the role of religion in culture, and even glimpses of a concern about an acidic sort of individualism, all of which combined undermine good things in society. For example, we're painfully aware of how little we understand about the cultural unity which a political society today requires for a fruitful collaboration among its members. I think we know very little about this. We know very little about the cooperation that we need, a cooperation which cannot be secured solely through the coercive means of law, a cooperation which should not be attempted by top-down, state-driven ideologies of collective identity, a cooperation, that is society-wide cooperation, which must include spontaneous willingness to sacrifice one's interests for the good of others, even potentially at great cost to oneself. This picture was captured in an overwrought analogy by Alistair McIntyre. It's an analogy that has some truth to it, but again, it's overheated. But McIntyre asked about Western liberal democracies, well, asking someone to give their life in a war for such a polity would be like asking someone to die for AT&T. Now, religion supplies one way to thicken these social bonds. A stable faith can generate a greater sense of community. We are also painfully aware of the fragility in many countries in the world of peace among different religious groups, and of the special difficulty of sustaining collaboration for common purposes across religious boundaries. Proselytization is in some places a source of conflict between and among religious groups. Prohibiting it can reasonably be seen as a means of keeping the peace among contending religious groups. And indeed, the embeddedness of religion in culture and in social life, such as suggested in the passage I read a few minutes ago, is an undeniable and, in general, a welcome fact. Pope John Paul II wrote, "At the heart of every culture lies the attitude man takes to the greatest mystery, the mystery of God. Different cultures," JP2 said, "are basically different ways of facing the question of the meaning of personal existence. But now the late Pope's observation does not imply approval of any static or closed culture. In fact, John Paul II often spoke enthusiastically in favor of a critical theological culture, a critical, we say open society, critical society, but he was describing in part a critical theological culture in a particular place. And John Paul II never, and I mean never, uttered a word of approval or anything like it for a state establishment of religion, even where Catholicism was or might have been the established religion. Now further, cause for caution. Abdullah ad-Naim argues that proselytization question involves an individualistic conception of freedom of religion, which, he says, cannot adequately address the concerns of communities about proselytization and its consequences. What's needed, he says, is a dynamic and creative understanding of collective rights. Now, I agree that international legal norms of religious liberty and the local constitutional law of many Western countries is deficient, perhaps gravely deficient, when it comes to comprehending and protecting institutional religious identity. You might say our law has tilted too far in the direction of individual autonomy and has shortchanged institutional autonomy, institutional conscientious objection, if you will, in the process. Nonetheless, although there's a great deal more that could be said, and some of it's sympathetic, like these comments, about the compact, rich passage from the Hackett volume I quoted, on this occasion I want to make just one further comment, and it's a very critical one indeed. Think of religious liberty that way, the way described implicitly and explicitly in the passage from the Hackett volume about religion's embeddedness at the core, or as a linchpin of a traditional way of life which is, again, seen to be very fragile in the face of cross-cutting truth claims by religions which are not with that local program, you might say. Think of religious liberty that way and you will decapitate it. You will. The duty of any political community to respect religious liberty, as it is defined in countless constitutional, legal, and yes, even religious documents, and the duty to respect it, even in people whose beliefs and practices are false or misguided, this duty to respect religious liberty is, in the end, rooted in the basic moral, and not in the first instance legal or social, moral duty of everyone to seek the truth about reality, including reality's furthest reaches, which transcend the concerns of the political community itself. And the duty of everyone, the moral duty, to shape one's life according to what one judges to be the truth about reality. From here, one can see, I think, straight away that anti-conversion, anti-proselytization laws, that is the matrix, strike at or near the heart of religious liberty. From here, you can see, too, that if one thinks of religious liberty in a different way, if one thinks of religious liberty as attaching to, or among other things perhaps, a social order in which religion plays an important role, and if one credits reports that even peaceful encounters with articulated alternate conceptions of reality, if one credits reports that these are experiences of attempted destruction, well, from this way of looking at things, you might well then affirm some putative right of non-interference. But then one will have drifted very far from the traditional understanding of religious freedom we find in so many authoritative documents. And one will have abandoned the foundations, the moral and philosophical foundations of it altogether.
Thank you, Jerry. Jose.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be back in Georgetown because I'm actually this semester away, so it's a great opportunity to come back, and thank you Tam, for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here. You heard before that we were going to fight it out, that we are going to be entertaining. I'm afraid we are going to be very earnest, very serious. I do not see my task as winning points in a debate. I concede defeat to Jerry from the very beginning. You can never really win against a professor of law in arguments. And I can never win with his humor. I mean, basically, he's much more humorous than I am. So I'm not going to try to basically win points. But not only that, I see my task and obligation, and I'm saying the obligation, to complicate our frameworks and to bring contextual problems into our discussions. Indeed, I'm going to argue both for and against proselytism. Not because I want to have it both ways, have the cake and eat it too, but because I'm torn. I'm truly torn, and I see the arguments for and against, and I want to divide these arguments into theological rationales, for and against proselytism, legal rationales, for and against proselytism, and sociocultural rationales, for and against proselytism. So let me begin with the theological rationales. I fully acknowledge the religious duty to preach the good news, to proclaim the gospel. For some religions, at least, certainly for Christianity, this is a duty, an obligation, which must be taken very seriously as central to their religion. And we heard a very eloquent presentation this morning from a Baptist point of view. But against this religious duty, there is a moral obligation, which I must take equally seriously, to respect other good news and other gospels, which other religious persons, which other humans take equally seriously. In the case of the Christian gospel, the mystery of salvation is complicated by the historicity of revelation and of God's economy of salvation. Just think of the genealogy of Jesus, as it appears in the Gospels, as being linked directly to Abraham. But this reveals it precisely as a particular genealogy of the children of Abraham that has nothing to do with other unrelated ancestries. Now here we are confronting the fundamental theological, philosophical paradox, which becomes evident with the multiple competing universalisms which emerge with the axial age: Jewish, Greek, Confucian, Buddhist, etc. Axial age was a term invented by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers to characterize this period of time, roughly between the 6th and the 4th century before Christ, in which all our universalistic, philosophical, moral, and religious conceptions emerge. And basically, all the others we have are derivation from this. The prophet Isaiah, Zoroaster, Socrates, Plato, Confucius, Buddha, all of them are contemporaries. All of them are universalist prophets teaching a particular universalism. And the lesson which I, as a student of history, take is that every universalism is particularistic and irremediably so. The mystery of salvation, for a Catholic at least, which I am, consists in the fact that the proposition extra ecclesia nulla salus, there is no salvation outside of the church, or there is salvation only through Jesus Christ, would exclude perhaps as much as 90% of humanity from God's plans of salvation, if we take it literally. Obviously, it is very hard to accept such a notion, and therefore we need other theological rationales to understand how the different religions may be parts, all of them, of God's plans of salvation. Certainly we should be with a lot of humility. We should not try to arrogate ourselves that we are the ones that know God's ways and that we know God's plans for humanity and for creation. So this is the first pro and con theological rationale. The second, legal juridical rationales for and against. I accept and defend the right to freedom of conscience and freedom of religion as an inalienable individual right. I'm willing to concede gladly that this is the first basic mother individual right and the foundation of every other right. Paradoxically, it emerged precisely out of the wars of religion in early modern Europe against the very Westphalian principle, cuius regio eius religio, that the subjects should have the religion of their sovereigns. And here again, the good lesson, it was the Baptists who became ones against this very principle. And it came out, it was not the freedom of religion that came out of the wars. What came out of the wars was the freedom to emigrate, which was a recognition that indeed the sectarians have no right to stay in somebody's territory, but have the right to take their religion with them, and nobody has the right to coerce them to accept other religion. And of course, then it was those sectarians that brought this principle to the American colonies. Not all of them, as we know. Many of them had also established churches. So this is the fundamental, inalienable right of every individual. The right to exit, the right to conversion, the right to be born again, which the religious sects brought to the American colonies. But this individual right, I would argue legally, cannot be translated into an equally inalienable right, namely that it is my right to proselytize and to convert others. It may be a religious duty, but to proselytize is not a right. It's not a legal right in the same sense. I have a right to the free exercise of my religion, but this right will inevitably clash with the right of others to the free exercise of their religion. And here is where we are entering into rights, we're entering into legal context. And legal context means legal national context. Now, within a legal national context, I'm willing to accept the principle there is practically no limitations to the right to proselytize. When it comes to international context, it becomes much more problematic. The international context of multiple legal constitutional jurisdictions, in which the right to proselytize would need to be translated into the right to go anywhere in the world and preach my gospel, which bumps into the right of states to control their borders to control entry and exit. Taken to its extreme, the right to proselytize precisely would be that. No borders. There should be no control of entry and exit. But of course, very few people that are for the right to proselytize and to go to other places are willing to open the American borders to anybody who wanted to come here. I mean, I don't think that many Southern Baptists are willing to argue for open borders in the South of the United States to immigration. It's a fastidious issue, but I'm raising it because once we enter into the legal structure of rights, they are embedded in nation states, they are embedded in territorial states. And here we enter into the difficulties and contradictions of an international rights regime enforced by sovereign states. Now, I am adamantly opposed to the principle cuius regio eius religio, namely that sovereign states have the right to determine the religion or religions of their subjects. But there is a need of a state regulation of some kind, of religious pluralism, which, however, will take many different sociocultural and constitutional forms. And so we have here the fundamental difference between European and American conceptions, even of religious freedom. I mean, I always feel myself a European in America and American in Europe. There are fundamental differences because the experience of American religious denominationalism is radically different from the experience of European confessionalism, which is a territorialized, nationalized religion. And so, but then even within Europe, the European Union can have no religious policy across the European Union because no nation in Europe would accept the model of any other European nation. Nobody would accept the French model for all of Europe, but neither they would accept the German model or the Nordic model and so on. So if even between Europe and the United States are such fundamental differences, if even within European countries are such fundamental differences, we have to be open to the fact that we are dealing here with very, very important sociocultural differences. And so, sociocultural rationales for and against proselytization. How am I doing with time?
Fine.
Yes. The very working definition of proselytism we are given, the effort to win adherence for one's religious community through persuasion, illustrates the problems. A world of religious communities in which proselytism is a zero-sum game, in which my win is your loss, is a recipe for interreligious conflict on a global scale, unless, of course, you have a system of denominationalism as you have in the United States. If we could come to develop a system of global denominationalism, to which I'll come later, there will be a possibility. But this very definition is based on three problematic presuppositions. First, that individuals can change religious communities at will, that religious communities are nothing but voluntary associations, confessions, or denominations. And Jerry has already pointed out the fundamental differences of a voluntary religious community versus what Hannah Arendt called natal religions. Those religions into which individuals are born, and therefore religions which not only do not really accept the right to exit, although they have to, but they have no right to enter either. They do not accept the right to enter. Today there was a discussion within the Jewish community, the whole issue of conversion or not, and only confronted with the issue of demographic issues. High fertility is the solution of Orthodox Jews. Intermarriage is the solution of more liberal Jews, and so on. So you enter into a fundamental problem. Of course, you could say, well, yes, let's eliminate these conceptions of religion, which are based on a historical form that should disappear. I'm less willing to argue this in the consequences of impoverishment of humanity this will entail. In a similar group of religions, to natal religions like Judaism and Hinduism, those are the two typical natal religions, one must recognize all those linked to ancestor cults, yes, such as the Asian Confucian religions, Chinese folk religions, but also many African religions in which kinship obligations across generations, binding the living and the dead, are central. Here, to exit means to abandon one's kinship obligations and kinship solidarity for egoistic individualism. And of course, it's a way of becoming modern. And this is what conversion to modernity in many ways means. But it has consequences for communities. The second problematic presupposition, that individuals need to choose to belong to one particular religious community rather than another, rather than being able to belong simultaneously to multiple religious communities or to none at all. We have a conception of religion as religious community belonging that, of course, for the Chinese, doesn't make much sense. If you ask them, are you Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist, all of the above, or none? Both of them, of course, are wrong answers from our perspective. But it's not unlike our all binary definitions of race, either white or black, until you allow in the census to say all of the above. And then somebody can be white and black and Hispanic and so on and so on. And the point is that Asian religions were precisely all of the above. And so we have to understand that a large part of humanity has been based on a very different conception of religious pluralism than ours. Finally, conversions through persuasion. This was argued. The notion that it is a cognitive, rational choice process through which individual weighs the pros and cons of the various alternatives and settle for the one which makes sense to them. This is very problematic, precisely because we have a conception of grace and faith, which is not simply a choice that people make, but somehow there is a higher force. We do not grasp religions. Religions grasp us sometimes. And this is also a tension with both the utilitarian liberal individual model of rational choice, which was presented very, very eloquently in the previous panel, or a Habermasian world of undistorted communication in which the better and more rational arguments prevails. Well, the fact is that persuasion is rarely simply this either rational choice or this undistorted and equal form of communication. That persuasion is always linked to inequality, also to force, to seduction, and to other things. Now, and let me finish with that, There is one type of proselytism which I can embrace, and this is that of Mother Teresa, the one who bears witness to one's faith by serving the most disprivileged and becoming one of them, joining them in the community instead of making all of them part of my community. And I would hope that we can aspire to a system of global denominationalism in which everybody is ready to affirm with Mother Teresa, I love all religions, but I'm in love with my own religion.
Thank you, Jose. Well, I want to get everyone involved here. Melinda, there you are. I always learn debating points from Jose. One is always end with Mother Teresa. The other is begin with, I concede the debate to my opponent, I'm going to debate myself. Let me turn briefly to Jerry for a response, and then Jose, a brief rebuttal if you like. There's not really rebuttal response, but and those of you in the audience who would like to ask questions, please get them ready. We've got our microphone here. Jerry.
Sure. Well, in his typically disarming way, an amiable manner, Jose brings up a question which I'd like to push just a step or two further. It remarks upon the Orthodox Christian belief in the indispensability of Jesus' salvific sacrifice to salvation for all of us, and says that 90% of the world would be excluded from salvation if that's true, or if something like that is true. Now, within the Catholic Church, certainly more recently, since Vatican II, I should say, it's been explicitly taught that it's precisely on the path of the moral life that the way of salvation is open to everyone. But let's take this possibility that the Christian faith affirms, at least its Orthodox versions, let's just call it an intuitively unattractive and even improbable position about the availability of the means of salvation. And let's even say it's more intuitively appealing and more probable that Gandhi is right. Gandhi said somewhere something very close to all the religions are different paths to the same place, so why is everybody getting so excited about which one? Well, it seems to me that what I am proposing or preaching, if I may say, is that those be considered in a kind of critical theological context within political society, but viewing it more as a cultural phenomenon, a social tradition of argument, rather than something that the state is involved in except in very indirect and light-handed ways. But I think those are propositions that ought to be debated, that the end point in view should be to have a society in which proponents of the Orthodox Christian view and of Gandhi's view can peacefully argue about which of the two of them is true, positions is true, or closer to the truth, or at least by hypothesis, they could discover that each is partly right and partly wrong, and that some synthesis of the two is really in order. And I think that's the desirable end state. And I think that at least the matrix of laws that I'm talking about and trying to get at and critically evaluate stymie that critical theological culture, and I think that's the main thing that's wrong with those laws.
Very briefly, two issues. Again, this morning our Baptist brother spoke very eloquently of this duty of Baptist communities to go and preach the gospel. I used to go with them to Ukraine in '89, and I was fascinated. They were coming to Ukraine to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ. I asked, do you know that these people have been Christians for 1,000 years? Do you know anything about Eastern Christianity? No, why should I? It is the notion that even the respect of other Christians, of other Christian traditions, because the real issue, as our colleague mentioned, is not so much the conflict between religions, but within religions. This is the real issue, and this was the real issue, of course, of Christians killing each other. This was the real issue, and that's why religious freedom came about, eventually. Although, again, as a Catholic, I have to recognize it took the Catholic Church a lot of time to recognize this self-evident truth. So we have to be humble and recognize the cultural historicity of our values. I'm willing to be a child of my age and defend those norms, but with a humble recognition that probably I'm going to be wrong, or that our successors will see that we were a lot wrong on many issues. So we simply have to accept a certain cultural humility, and the church, of course, all the time recognizes its own errors, historical, and how many sins it has committed. So this is one issue. The second issue is concerning, the type of society I want is, of course, that. An open society in which all intelligent creeds can live with one another. As I mentioned, it's not only societies, for me, a type of global denominationalism, in which not so much through international regulation, because it would be terrible, but through a process of mutual recognition, the way denominationalism emerged in the United States. It was not the state recognizing religious communities. There was no law of recognition. It was a mutual denomination is the name I give myself and by which others know me. And we recognize each other. And of course, the paradox is that against the thesis of relativism, that religious pluralism leads to relativism, this is a very European principle. In America, we see that actually religious pluralism is compatible with very strong certainties in your own religions. Now, this, of course, implies the recognition that hopefully we can live in a world of terribly religiously pluralistic, and that in which the aim is not that everybody will eventually find the one single truth. And here again, models of religious pluralism, I just want to point out, India and the United States, those are probably the two most religious pluralistic societies in the world, but have radically different models of religious pluralism. So we simply, for me as a sociologist, I have to recognize those things and be open to the questions which they put to our norms and our values.
Okay, I'm delighted to hear Jose say international regulation would be horrible. Make sure people mark that. I believe we have a question over here with Alan Hertzke.
Yes, Jose raised a very important point, and I wanted to get Jerry's take on it, which was the issue of sovereign states' right to control their borders, and which presumably could mean that they could restrict the ability of outside missionaries coming in to evangelize. And I'm wondering if, in fact, that is compatible. It seems to me it would be compatible with kind of international norms on religious freedom, that a society could say, no, we're not going to allow international, religious missionaries, but we are going to allow conversions. We're going to allow local missionary activity by indigenous peoples, which is compatible with international norms. And I'm just wondering if this could be a way to deal with a kind of canard about proselytism, that it's always outsiders. When in fact, what we're really talking about is states attempting to repress the ability of local people to share their faith or to change their faith.
Well, I think I would agree, Alan, that the question of immigration, migration of missionaries is secondary to other concerns, and it's a different question than the just limits upon religious expression within a society. Even in the United States, we deny people entrance at the border for possession of views, political, I'm not sure about religious just as such, but for political and other views, which are for persons present in the United States, those folks could possess the exact same views and could never be punished or otherwise penalized for possessing them. So even in the United States, there's this kind of asymmetry between viewpoint discrimination, let's call it, at the borders compared to viewpoint discrimination domestically. And that seems, at least as such, to me at least, not unjust. But as you say, it leaves open the question of what the just laws would be within a society for indigenous expression, indigenous proselytization, and so on. And on that, I think that I would say only one thing about the precise question you raised about missionary access to a society. It seems to me that a society, any society, which has this kind of sovereign power over its borders, would be ill-advised to exercise that power precisely for the purpose or precisely for the reason that particular missionaries are presenting a viewpoint which is somehow undesirable or would disturb some folks who live in this country, or would be in some other sense annoying to members of that society. Because I think that viewpoint, that is to say, the view that we will exercise our authority over the borders on this kind of viewpoint discrimination, seems to me that you can't contain that as simply an immigration matter, that a society which takes that view will be hard-pressed to avoid extending the reasoning of that view to at least some domestic issues.
If I may only briefly, actually, the fact is that the accusations that, let's say, Pentecostalism is winning because American influence, of course, we know that this is not the case, that only when those religions become indigenous religions, they really begin to grow. I mentioned Ukraine because Ukraine is the only European country that broke away from the European model of a national state church and religious minorities. And you have a simultaneous situation of multiple national churches competing with one another, 3 Orthodox and 1 Catholic, and therefore opening the way all of them, churches and sects, become denominations, and all of them grow simultaneously, but all of them depend on indigenous ministers. With the exception of, actually, interestingly, Judaism and the Catholic Church that have basically foreign religious leaders, every other group basically has indigenous religious leaders.
Okay.
My name is John Holmes. I have a question that I would like to have asked in the last session, but I leave it to you wonderful scholars. How do we get away from what I call American secular hubris? For example, you can read it you Google it, Redwood Christian School in Marin County has beautiful acres that the county agrees can only be the place where they could build an adequate Christian school, and they keep turning them down. And the arbitrator who knew all the ins and outs of this said, if this decision ever came in the direction of the Christian school, these county officials would owe them $30 million in grievances. But they won't let them develop it, even though there's a public school across the street from it. Now, we're arguing about religion, but that's a religion unto itself. And to see the lack of application of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and also the religious rights of the one about institutionalized religious freedom and land use, it's shocking. But why should that school have to spend literally millions of dollars in their own good money to defend themselves in the 9th District Court and then try to get to the Supreme Court? Help me.
Well, I'm not licensed to practice law in this jurisdiction, so I won't say too much by way of trying to help you, but I can just say 1 or 2 things about the phenomenon. I mean, certainly there's no shortage in American culture, including its legal culture and even extending legal culture into the courts of, you could call it, as I think you are, a secularist bias against religion. Now, depending on precisely what the situation is, that is usually a legal wrong. Usually a legal wrong. But nonetheless, even our constitutional law, properly applied, has a certain secularist bias to it. But anyway, the case that you're describing sounds like it's inappropriate, and that it is unfortunate that people, including the Christian school under development or contemplated, has to pay money to defend itself against what, as you describe it at least, is a secularist bias against religion. But I think that good lawyering and I guess a few dollars will lead to this injustice, or this wrong against these people being corrected.
Well, this is actually not a very secularist society. So the interesting question is why this secularist hubris at this particular point. And I think that you have to understand the history of the United States and the relation between Protestant majorities and Catholic minorities, why the school became the place of the real wall of separation. It was the Baptists that became the defenders of the wall of separation until the 60s, when suddenly they thought public schools are run by secular humanism. Secular humanism is the established religion, and now we have to establish our own confessional schools, like the Catholics did in the 1840s when they refused to send their children to public schools that were really Protestant schools. So again, those are the kind of issues that one has to enter. It was President Obama for the first time that he added secular humanists to the civil religion, not only Protestant, Catholic, and Jews, but also Muslims and Hindus and secular humanists. This was, I mean, we know that public opinion polls will tell you that the American public is ready to elect a Muslim president, but not an atheist.
I think there was a secular humanist Christmas ornament on the Christmas tree, which is an interesting aspect of this. Okay, is that Angela Wu back there? Angela.
I thought I would intrude briefly just because the Redwood Christian case is a Becket Fund for Religious Liberty case.
Identify yourself, Angela.
Oh, sure. My name is Angela. I'm the International Law Director at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. That case is a great example of something that we see all the time, which is you have a very good law, in this case, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, that's written particularly to protect people who are disfavored in any particular community from having even their property rights for the purposes of religious expression intruded upon. But the working out of the law is what the difficulty is. And thankfully, what we have in America is a legal system that is fairly well used to dealing with different principles and looking usually objectively at different arguments and competing interests within communities. But I just wanted to say that I love that the example that's being brought up, partly because, I mean, it illustrates two things. One is that religious freedom really isn't just a theoretical thing. It's not just about speech, but that proselytism often cannot take place outside of a physical context. We're all trapped in the material world, trapped in physical bodies, and ultimately people need a place of worship, schools, places where they can teach and actually live out their religious beliefs. So you see that in the land use context, and I wouldn't want to divorce that from this conversation, partly because we talk about proselytism, but it's not just that the speech goes out there into a community. It often has an effect and an impact in terms of social norms that get changed, in terms of economics, when entire, say, classes of, the best example I can think of is Indians change religious faith partly because they're in low castes. There are these very real material impacts, and that's an incredibly important element of this debate. But the other thing that I thought was interesting is the Becket Fund, well, we defend people of all faiths, so what we see is that the disfavored minority in any given community, even within a country like America, so not even crossing national borders, but is different in every community. So in some places, secularists are the ones who are disfavored and discriminated against. In this particular situation, of course, being a lawyer for the school, I would say that there is a religious discrimination against this particular Christian school. But that balance changes all the time. And what you want to see, because you can't get rid of people's natural prejudices, is a legal and maybe social system that can navigate that in a fair way, where the judiciary and other people who are in power can objectively put aside their personal viewpoints and stand for a principle that applies actually to everybody. Because it's very, very easy for us to be convinced in any particular situation just by the religious identity of the person pushing their case rather than the principle itself, and then thinking about how that principle gets extrapolated when the power dynamics change. So I hope you'll forgive me that it's not a question, but maybe it'll engender some comments.
Thank you, Angela. You'll hear more from her in just a few minutes. Could we now take 3 quick questions, and you can respond, Angela, too, and because we're going to have to wrap it up. So Paul first, and then a couple of people up here.
Okay, just take one part.
Identify yourself, Paul.
Paul Marshall, the Hudson Institute. There is an area where there seems to be very wide agreement limiting proselytism, and that's with children, so underage people. There may be some, but I don't know of any religious group which defends or justifies sort of proselytizing people below a certain age without the agreement of their parents and so on. So that does seem to indicate some sort of agreement about power relations and being careful in proselytism that the person you're relating to is, in a position to deal adequately and fully with whatever you're saying. And I think as an example, it might be illuminating to find out what principles we're articulating there and how could we might apply them in other areas.
Okay. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask a question
Could you
about...
identify yourself, please?
I'm Bob Woodbury from the University of Texas at Austin. I would like to problematize the idea of natal religion or change. And I was wondering, when should we freeze change, either cultural, religious, or legal? One, there are no societies that are Catholic or Protestant or Muslim or Buddhist or most other religious traditions that were not something else first. So if we take the case of Afghanistan, Zoroastrianism started there, Mahayana Buddhism started there. Now neither of those. There were Christians in there from the 2nd century through the 1300s. There's now none there, etc. Buddhism was banned in China as a foreign religion, so was Christianity in the 800s, etc. So these religions aren't stable. When do we freeze them? Second, in terms of legal development, what's individual, what's corporatist? Would we have religious liberty or freedom of speech or freedom of organization without proselytizing groups in Europe and North America? The tensions that create those ideas are through the process of people trying to convert people and the conflict that comes out of that and coming to a thing of how do we get along. You see? So we don't want to freeze Europe in the 1200s.
Terrific, Bob. You'll hear from him in a minute, too. Okay, let's cut it off there and ask our two gentlemen to respond to those questions or comments.
Okay, I mean, I will respond to the second, which is, I think that you can respond to the first more. Fully agree. There is no notion that communities, religions are unchanging, we should freeze them. But we should abandon also the notions of one religion being higher than the others in a stage of development, because precisely the whole issue was the notion of progress in which a voluntary individualistic religion is higher than a natal one. I want to be in a world, and which is the world in which we are entering. The global cities of today are those cities in which all the religions of humanity, from the so-called most primitive to the most postmodern, are living together. And it is precisely the freedom of religion then allows the possibility of all these religions being together without necessarily also hierarchical divisions between them. So yes, I'm all for change, but also for the right to defend parts. I mean, the notion of if we are for the protection of endangered species, there are endangered cultures which are part of the wealth of humanity, and we are losing something. I mean, the Parsis, you mentioned the Parsis in Bombay. It will be a pity if this religion disappears, if this community can preserve itself. And of course, they were in India. They will never have been able to survive in Europe. So this is the second issue. Of course, we know Jehovah's Witness a lot. A lot of our freedoms we owe to Jehovah's Witness in the United States. They refusing to serve in the army, refusing to or willing to go to jail for their convictions. Yes, I fully agree with that. That's why I said I am for and against. I am for and against within myself. It's not that I'm arguing. I have to accept both principles.
Well, I think Paul Marshall makes an excellent point. I think there is widespread agreement about the, perhaps we can call it immunity of children from proselytizing efforts. I think it is a telling example, and if you begin to unpack it a bit, I think you'll see, as Paul suggests, some widely shared account of what's a proper power relationship, I think was one term that Paul referred to. I think that's part of it. I think you'll also see something I referred to in the opening of my remarks as parents' rights, which I think is maybe correct as far as it goes as a tag, but more about parents' responsibilities and duties towards their own children, and that if you unpack the immunity of kids to proselytizing, you probably will get a bit of a story about what the family is and what marriage involves and how kids are integrally part of that married couple's family. So maybe parents' rights is a less useful term here than parents' duties and responsibilities, which the state should respect and other people should respect. But perhaps most important, I think if you pull the thread of these kids' immunity, you'll learn more about the foundations of religious liberty. You know, more specifically, many of us, or several of us, have already talked today about not forcing people to convert, not manipulating them to convert, not providing unworthy incentives to people to convert. Now, I myself would affirm all of these as moral norms, but you'd wonder reasonably, well, why? Why would this be the case? And I think that you'd end up discovering that somewhere beneath these immunities about children and these wider moral norms about proselytizing in general, you'll see an account of religion, what it is, and how it appeals to people, that is traditional. Something like religion's the kind of thing that people really need to take ownership of, that it's something that should be authentically part of you. Now, you have to have a certain maturity and a certain functioning of critical judgment for, I think, sort of anything to be really yours, and that at some point during childhood, up until some age, kids don't possess that. So I think way down at the far end of the tunnel of explanation for this immunity, you probably would find, and without really tinkering with it or having to invent parts of it, I think you'd find a pretty fleshy account of the nature of religion as appealing to integrated emotional state person with some judgment, critically speaking, about the claims of that religion.
I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it off there, but I think that's a good place to cut it off. You know, what emerges from these discussions, among other things, is the question, what do the data tell us about this phenomenon of proselytism? What do empirical studies and legal studies tell us? And it just so happens that our next panel is going to take a look at the legal and social implications of proselytism. But before we get to that, we'll have a brief break. Will you join me in applauding this exercise in creeds intelligibly in conflict, Jose Casanova and Jerry Bradley?